today. Angela mentioned this Underground Railroad and the combination with quilts some time ago, and I had never heard of it. So I did a little research, and I found it, well, the idea of it really fascinating. I thank Allison for bringing that beautiful quilt today. I believe it has all of the patterns that I have on this one. They're just in a different order. So you can certainly see hers better than you can mine. This one came from the Welcome Center on I-26 heading to Asheville. This was made by the the Unaka Peacemakers. And I assume it's still hanging there, but they have the quilt and also a little legend explaining what the quilt squares are. In 1994, historian Jacqueline Tobin went to Charleston, South Carolina to learn more about sweetgrass baskets. And if you've ever been to Charleston and to the market, you know we have all seen those of the ladies making them. The women sit by pails of sweetgrass and weave the baskets, much like their ancestors did over 100 years ago. Jackie Tobin went to the old marketplace, and she was fascinated to watch the craftsmen there with their baskets. And many of them were descendants of slaves. And they were making the baskets surrounded by merchants of flea market trinkets and newer and cheaper baskets made in China and Thailand. As Jackie walked through the marketplace, she stopped at a stall filled with quilts of all sizes, colors, and patterns. She was admiring the quilts when the shopkeeper, an elderly African-American woman, began telling her that quilts were used by slaves to communicate about escaping to freedom on the Underground Railroad. Jackie was real puzzled as why this woman just began to tell her that story, but the shopkeeper stopped talking because she realized Jackie really wasn't that interested in the quilt story. But Jackie did purchase a quilt, and she took a flyer that advertised the Charleston Marketplace Quilts, and she left. It took Jackie almost 3 years to return to Charleston and finally hear the rest of the story from the shopkeeper, Ozella McDaniel Williams. On May 11, 1996, Ozella took Jackie to the back of the shop where they sat down among her rolls of quilts, and she told Jackie, "Write this down." It took Ozella about 3 hours to tell her story, and for Jackie, she said time stood still as she listened. Ozella's story had never been told before. It was passed down from her ancestors, great-grandmother, grandmother, her own mother. During the years that slavery was legal, it was against the law to teach slaves to read and write. So because of this, the information regarding escape plans had to be committed to memory and passed on by word of mouth, using codes and signs and signals created by slaves and shared only with those who could be trusted. Jacqueline Tobin and fellow historian Raymond Dobard chronicled the oral testimony of Ozella McWilliam Daniels in their book, Hidden in Plain View, A Secret Story of Quilts and the Underground Railroad. And here is the book, and I used the research in the book for what I'm telling you today. The book was published in 1998, and the use of the code was described as a plantation seamstress using her sewing abilities and having scraps of fabric that she took after making the clothing for the household, the things that were left over. And she would, this would be a sampler quilt, and then she would also take one pattern and make an entire quilt out of that pattern. And she practiced with the slaves who wanted their freedom until they knew the patterns and knew what they meant. And then, as you can see from the picture on Hidden in Plain View, it was not unusual for them to hang the quilts out when they were needing to be aired or when they had been washed and needed to be dried. So it wasn't odd to see them hanging over porch rails or on lines, and only the slaves knew really what these meant. This is the quilt code that goes with the quilt from the Unaka Peacemakers. This is also at the rest area, and I will read it to you. It says the monkey wrench, and it starts right here. I'll explain that one in a moment. The monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel toward Canada. With help from Jesus the carpenter, follow the bear's trail through the woods. Fill your baskets with enough food and supplies to get you to the crossroads. Once you get to the crossroads, dig a log cabin in the ground. Shoefly told us to dress up in cotton and satin bow ties. Follow the flying geese and birds in the air. Stay on the drunkard's path. Take the sailboat across the Great Lakes to the North Star above Canada. The quilt square in the upper left-hand corner is known as Jacob's Ladder, and this was the symbol used for the Underground Railroad. So once people saw this, they knew that there would be help for them. Moving on, this one is the monkey wrench. And the monkey wrench meant for slaves to gather the tools needed for a long journey. And I found this interesting. The plantation blacksmith was also called the monkey wrench. And he was allowed to visit other plantations when they needed his skills as a blacksmith. So he was able to leave, to travel, and to see more of the area than a normal slave would see. The blacksmith was probably one of the masterminds who helped plan the escape. The next one is the wagon wheel. And the wagon wheel meant for the slaves to load the wagon or prepare to board the wagon to begin the escape. Wagons were the primary means of transporting runaways in their hidden compartments. And the wagon was the chariot that would carry them home. The next one is the carpenter's block or wheel, and it means Jesus would guide them. Jesus was the carpenter, and many spirituals instruct the slave listeners to steal away to Jesus or to run to Jesus. We view the setting sun as a blazing wheel of fire, meaning the slaves were to go forward toward the setting sun, moving northwest through the Appalachian Mountains and into Ohio. The next one is the bear paw. And the bear paw meant for the slaves to follow the mountain trail made by their tracks. The path would lead them to food and water toward the crossroads, which was Cleveland, Ohio. The next one right here is the basket. And again, all of these are back there on Allison's quilt, which you can see the patterns better. But the basket meant that this was a place where the runaway slaves could stop and get food and supplies for the rest of their journey. The crossroad block refers to Cleveland, Ohio, sitting at the crossroads of many paths to freedom. 4 or 5 overland trails connected to numerous water routes crossing Lake Erie into Canada and freedom. The log cabin block was a sign drawn in dirt to signify a person was safe to talk to. It also advises seeking shelter. The next one was called the shoefly, and a quilt made of this identified a friendly guide who was nearby to help the runaway slaves. And the next one in this row was the bow tie. And the bow tie meant that a change of clothes would be needed. Now, after these people had been in the woods for all this time, they needed to clean up. Otherwise, when they got to Cleveland, they were going to look like what they were, runaway slaves. But if they were cleaned up and nice clothing that had been provided for them, then they wouldn't stand out so much. So this was signifying a place to change, to get cleaned up on their way to freedom. The next one is the flying geese block, and it meant to follow the geese as they were making their way north in spring and summer. It was interesting to note that most runaway slaves did so in the spring, and also this one told them, and I'm told that one of these would have been a different color or different fabric so it would stand out, and it was pointing the way that they should go, which would be north, and the birds coming back from the south over the winter in spring would be going north. Also, I'll show you my little books here in a moment, but also it was a good time for them to leave when it was raining. So a rainy night was good because that meant the next day the workers would not be able to be in the muddy fields to work. So that would give them an extra day before they were missed. Okay, the next one is the birds in the air block, which is very similar to this, again following the birds as they were making their way north. And also the birds knew where it was safe to stop, to rest, and to find water. The next one is the drunkard's path block, and it meant for them to not walk in a straight line. If men were after them with dogs, this would confuse them, so they were encouraged to zigzag their way back and forth in a drunkard's path so they could elude any catchers that were out looking for them. The next one is the sailboat, and that meant that they were at the Great Lakes, and just a trip across the water would be Canada and freedom. And the last one was the North Star block, and it meant for the slaves to follow the North Star to Canada. Jackie Tobin visited Ozella McDaniel Williams in Charleston again in May of 1998 to thank her for allowing them to write her story. And 2 weeks later, Ozella passed away on May 17, 1998. At her funeral on May 23rd, Ozella was laid to rest with the song, "May the Work I've Done Speak for Me." And now, to conclude, we don't know whether this was fact or myth. There are a lot of people who believe that this absolutely was the truth, the quilts were used, and there are a lot who believe that someone just made up a nice story. I have two little books here. This one is Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt. Being a first grade teacher, I have to go to my little books here. Her quilt was quite different. She had used a pattern. Let's pick this back up. She had used a pattern, and if you'll notice, the blue would represent bodies of water, rivers and streams they would have to cross, and the other colors would be just the pathways that they were to follow. This is not quite the same idea as this one. And the other one is the patchwork path, and this one is using the idea of the quilts that we see, where the people had to memorize what each quilt block meant to them on their way to safety. A lot has been said, like how would a slave have access to the material to use in these quilts? And that would be explained by, of course, the lady would be a seamstress for the family. And no matter how carefully you try to cut, there's always some scrap left over. And that she would use these to make her quilts. They also said that when they took oral histories from the slaves in 1930, that not one of them mentioned anything about a quilt code for the underground railway. It would have been nice if they could have been riding in a wagon and gone like for them, wouldn't it? One person accuses Jackie Tobin and Raymond DeBard of having taken folklore and said that it was historical fact. They offer no evidence and no documentation to support their book. And the last thing they say is there are no quilts left, if there ever were any, to exhibit. And the answer to that is that, first of all, the quilts would have been washed in lye soap and hung out to dry and used. They were not used as something decorative, but they were used to sleep under at night to keep you warm. And the quilts would be very, very fragile. So it isn't surprising that none of them are still in existence today. So fact or myth, people agree that the idea of a quilt code is compelling. A lady named Bonnie Browning of the American Quilters Society in Paducah, Kentucky, summed it up by saying, fact or myth, it makes a wonderful story. Thank you.